Hello and welcome to another episode of Formula One for Fummies. Now, it's been quite a while since I released an episode for this podcast, but I thought it appropriate that I make my grand and triumphant return the week after the oldest and most illustrious Grand Prix on the F1 calendar. And in the spirit of the Temple of Speed that is Monza, today we will be talking about race strategy and the different approaches taken by teams. So I guess we need to ask ourselves, what influences race strategy? What are the things that are most important to consider and to think about when coming up with a strategy for the team and then for the specific driver as well? Now, given that the previous episode was about tires, let's maybe take a pit stop there first and talk about the things or the elements in Formula One that's the most obvious and within the current set of rules, probably the most powerful strategy differentiator. Now, as I discussed in the previous episode, for every race, you'll basically assign 3 sets of tires. You get the hard compound, the medium compound, and the soft compound. Now, just in terms of a quick recap, obviously, the names are pretty self-explanatory, with the hard compound being the hardest rubber and the soft being the softest, with the difference in speed being effectively the softer tires are easier to warm up, are grippier in general, and therefore produces the faster lap time, but wears out more quickly, where obviously your hard tire is harder, therefore lasts longer, but then also doesn't necessarily generate the same lap time that the soft could potentially do. Now, where strategy comes into play is the rule that basically states that every driver needs to use 2 different tire compounds in the race. So if you start on the medium tires, you need to at least move on to either the hard or the soft compound at some point during the race. And you can't, for example, do medium or soft. You need to have 2 different types in the race. And then this impacts your qualifying strategy as well, due to another rule that basically says that whichever tire, if you're in the top 10, obviously in qualifying, whichever tire you use to qualify to set your fastest lap time in the second stage of qualifying, you need to start on that tire in the race. This therefore means that qualifying already determines your race strategy in a way, since you need to decide during qualifying already what tire you're going to start the race on, and then consequently what the next compound will be you will switch onto during the race after wearing out your initial starting tire compound. Now, there are usually 2 considerations when making this decision and when thinking about which tire you're going to use in Q2. Now, the soft tire has more traction off the start line. So off the grid itself, you have more traction on the soft tire, which makes sense. The soft tire is the grippiest tire available to you. So the tire will grip more into the surface when, getting off the line during your race start, which then means you'll probably have a bit of a quicker, getaway off the line, and that can open some opportunities for you, open up some opportunities for you on the opening lap of the race to maybe overtake a few cars that qualified ahead of you. But now, obviously, the downside is this tire degrades more quickly and it overheats more quickly. So you also need to be very careful to not wear your tire out too quickly at the beginning of the race, which then means the race at the later stages could become a bit of a difficult situation if everybody around you is on relatively fresh tires and your last set of tires are quite worn out. Now, the converse to this is if you decide to start on a harder compound tire, so in other words, the medium or the hard compound tire, and the main advantage of deciding to start on the medium or the hard compound tire is you can extend your first stint effectively. So your first series of laps on that opening tire, you can extend it longer, which therefore means you can keep your options open in terms of strategy. So if things happen in the race, if the picture changes, you effectively keep your options open for longer, given that you are on a tire that will wear less slowly than a soft tire. Now, obviously for teams it's harder to qualify Q2 on a harder compound just because it's slower. So if you are if it's very close between your car and the, some of the other teams' cars, and they all qualify on the soft tire, the slower hard tire is going to be difficult to qualify on, given that it's going to probably negatively affect your starting position on the grid. So you'll only see, if you think about the races this year so far, you'll probably only see Mercedes, Ferrari and Red Bull take the decision to perhaps do a run in Q2 on the medium tires to maybe see if they are fast enough to get through into Q3 without having to do a qualifying lap on the softer tires. And that then, as I've mentioned, opens up a lot more strategic options for them for the race the next day. Now, this is also, everything that I've now just mentioned about the tires is very important to keep in mind throughout the entire episode, as the tires effectively affects every strategy call that the teams make, as you'll see when I discuss some of the other aspects to consider when deciding on your strategy. Now, the next thing to talk about are pit stops. Now, a pit stop is a pivotal part of the race as well. And I think most people, even people that don't really watch Formula One, have all seen an F1 pit stop and how amazingly fast and efficient they can change 4 tires on each side of the car and get that car up and down in less than 3 seconds almost every time. It's a spectacular sight to see, and then also it plays a very, very crucial role in the strategy that a team decides on. Now, when you listen to the commentators, you'll hear they speak about a 1-stop, a 2-stop, or even sometimes a 3-stop race. So what this basically means is most of the time there's an expectation, even before the race starts, around whether a strategy with only 1 pit stop, in other words, you only should change tires once, or a strategy with 2 pit stops or even 3 pit stops, which one of those could be the fastest? And when we talk about the fastest strategy in terms of pit stops, it's a very fine balance that a team needs to consider or needs to achieve in terms of tire wear and time spent actually getting a pit stop. Because when you go and take your pit stop, you are subject to a speed limiter in the pit lane. So I think it's 60 kilometers an hour, 80 kilometers an hour. I think it depends on the track itself. But while you are in the pit lane about to take your pit stop, you are driving a lot slower than what obviously the cars are doing out on the racetrack. So that costs you a lot of time. And then obviously when changing the tires also takes about 3 to 4 seconds. And then again, exiting the pit lane at that speed limiter again costs you time. So on average, I would say more or less a pit stop typically takes you a team between 18 to 25 seconds. And this varies between tracks because all of the tracks have different, pit entrances and pit exits and different lengths of the pit lane. So the time it takes to make a pit stop is very variable between tracks. And this is extremely important because obviously a track where it takes a bit longer to make a pit stop, you'll probably see teams try and make only 1 pit stop during the race because they know that despite the fact that tire wear is probably going to be a bit more of an issue and that the drivers are going to have to manage their tires a lot better and maybe not drive flat out, the time lost making an extra pit stop is going to be too much to compensate for the fact that you have faster tires if you make this extra pit stop. So the actual type of track is extremely influential in the amounts of pit stops the teams decide to make because of the fact that the extra time you win by putting on a new set of tires is offset with the time lost in making an extra pit stop. So the teams are constantly sort of running simulations to try and understand whether you can make up basically the time lost in making another pit stop with fresher tires relative to everybody else that did not make a pit stop. And it plays a very important role in the teams deciding what strategy they're going to follow and what tires they want to start the race on and then also what tires they want to finish the race on, as I've mentioned earlier. And then the pit stops brings in another element called the undercut and the overcut. Now, the undercut is effectively if you are, let's say, a second, or you're basically quite close behind the car in front of you. The team calls you in to make a pit stop. Obviously, you make your pit stop. You put on a set of fresh, brand new tires, and you go out and you set an incredibly fast lap on your brand new tires to effectively overtake the car in front of you on the track. Because the car in front of you will still be on much older tires, which then means you'll probably gain lap time relative to that car if you make your pit stop and then do 1 or 2 laps before that individual then makes his pit stop. So you effectively put on your new tires, put in some very, very fast laps on these new tires, and then overtake the car in front of you when that car eventually makes a pit stop. Because obviously the time in the pit lane is going to take more or less the same, but then you've put in a few laps that were much faster than the guy in front on the older tires. That's effectively what an undercut is. Then the converse of this is what's called an overcut. So you as the team effectively decide to stay out much longer. If you have good tire management, you can maybe still put in good lap times relative to the guys on the new fresher tires, and then make your pit stop much later and then be on much fresher tires for the end of the race, where the guys who made their pit stops earlier will then be on older tires. So that's effectively the overcut, but the overcut is very dependent on how well the car in front can actually keep his starting set of tires alive, and how quickly he can actually set lap times versus the guys on the much fresher tires behind. So I think the best way to understand the undercut and the overcut is to actually look to go and watch a race, because every single race the discussion about the undercut and the overcut is had, and it's a strategy that the teams use very, very frequently, especially the undercut. The overcut is a bit more rare, given the fact that usually when you're in front after the first round of pit stops, overtaking on the track is going to always be a bit more difficult, but you do get cases where the overcut actually is the better strategy. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, the second last thing I want to talk about in terms of things that determine a team's race strategy is the car setup itself. So effectively how the team sets up their car for the race, and then in general for the whole season, like the fundamental design philosophy of the car, because this also impacts the actual strategy that the team will employ. And I think we actually saw this very nicely with the Italian Grand Prix last week, where you saw a very nice contrast between design philosophies when looking at the Ferrari in front and then the Mercedes following closely behind, and how the two cars generated their lap times and what impact it then had on the strategy that were used by the teams. So in terms of, and I'm going to give a broad overview of the car philosophies that you could potentially have. So you can have a high drag, high downforce setup, which effectively means the car is much better in the corners because it has a lot more downforce and grip through the corners, but then slower on the straights because effectively the car generates more drag due to the fact that it has a more downforcey setup. This then means you as a driver of this high downforce, high drag car will have a tougher time overtaking cars just because you have that straight line speed deficit. Now, the converse of this is you have, and we've seen that quite often this year so far, is you'll have better tire management because of the greater forces pushing the car into the track. The car slides around a lot less, which then means the tires wear less severely. And that's obviously the converse impact of having a high drag, high downforce car. And then the opposite of this is then a low drag, low downforce car, which then means, like the Ferrari this year is a good example of a car like that, where it struggles a bit more in the corners and it slides a lot more, but it's incredibly fast on the straights, as we saw last week in Monza, where it was just impossible for the Mercedes to overtake Charles Leclerc on any of the straights because the Ferrari was so fast in the straight line that even though the Mercedes was able to stick with the Ferrari throughout the whole lap, especially through the more twisty bits, it wasn't able to overtake on the straight just because the Ferrari is so fast. Now, taking all of this into account, each and every team tries to again reach the perfect balance for a specific racetrack every race weekend, where they need to consider obviously the design philosophy of their car. So for example, Mercedes this year has a design philosophy with a higher downforce, higher drag setup, but then taking that philosophy and making adjustments to optimize the car for a racetrack like Monza that has a lot of long straights, which then means they would need a bit more straight line speed. So then they do change a few things on the car itself, but obviously you can't change the whole philosophy of the car, and that then influences strategy, where ideally if you are in a situation like that, you would want to qualify as far up front as possible, because you know when the race actually starts, overtaking is going to be a difficult situation. And then it might also influence the type of tires you decide to start on, given that you're probably going to be following some cars, as we saw Mercedes do on Sunday, for an extended period of time. Now, the last thing I want to talk about that is a very, very important piece in race strategy, and this is not something that the teams can typically plan ahead for, which obviously makes it very exciting when it does happen in the race, or when it does play out in a way that forces teams to adapt and adjust. And this is the safety car. Now, what happens and what effectively happens with the safety car is obviously if someone crashes, or if there's some incident on the track that requires, for safety reasons, the other cars on the track to go around a lot more slowly, the FIA or the race director typically deploys the safety car, which then means it's like a production car effectively, that then leads all of the Formula One cars behind it, and basically does laps around the track at a much reduced pace. Now, what this means is if you are in the right place at the right time and the safety car is called, everybody else's speed is significantly reduced, which then means if you can go make a pit stop during that time, the time lost relative to everybody else that's going around the racetrack is a lot less, because everybody else is going slowly as well. So where traditionally you will be much slower in the pit lane due to the limiters that they put on your speed in the pit lane, versus everybody going at full speed around the racetrack, now everybody else is going slowly as well, which then means you actually win time relative to everybody else if, for example, your opponents had to make their pit stops under normal race conditions. Now, that's why the safety car is such a strategic chess piece, if you can call it that, because if you play your cards right as a team, you can effectively get a free pit stop. In other words, put on new tires without having the downside of losing a lot of time in making the pit stop itself. And this is a very important reason as to why you as a team would want to keep your options open for longer in the race. In other words, why you would want to consider maybe starting the race on a harder tire, which then means you can extend your first stint for longer, which then if there is a safety car at some point in the race, you could maybe go and get a free pit stop, where people that started on the softer tires had to make pit stops earlier just because of the fact that the tires wear out more quickly. So this is obviously a very, very handy trick that the teams can pull, but the timing of this is crucial, because you need to actually take advantage of the safety car before the cars bunch up behind the safety car, because the converse impact that it could have is obviously when the safety car is going slowly relative to the Formula One cars, the Formula One cars effectively form a super long queue behind the safety car as it goes around the track. And now when you're sitting in this queue already and then decide to make a pit stop, then you're going to lose so many positions, and you're basically going to go from whichever position you were in right back to the end of the pack, just because of the nature of how a safety car works. But again, I really would consider telling you guys to go and watch a race. A safety car is quite common in terms of you usually get at least one during a race, but you'll definitely, if you watch a couple of races, you'll see a safety car come out and then see what impact the safety car has, and you'll probably see a lot of teams immediately just go and make a lot of pit stops, and that usually also leads to a lot of chaos in the pit lane because so many cars are coming in at once, and that's usually always quite entertaining to see. Now, there are obviously a whole lot more we can say about the topic of strategy, and I think as soon as you watch a couple of races, you'll start to see how many permutations there are of just different strategy calls. But hopefully this episode gave you a relatively good idea of the things strategists think about and what they consider when planning for a race, and then also in the race itself, how quickly they're able to think on their feet and decide what they're going to do with each of the two cars that they need to support. Now, if you want to hear more about Formula One, please do not hesitate to listen to my main podcast, the TF1 Show, where I discuss all things F1 once a week. And please also look out for my next episode of F1 for Fummies, and hopefully I'll be back soon.